And now it's 2 o'clock. I wanted to introduce myself. I am Sarah Smith. I am District Dean of Libraries and Chair of the Affordable and Open Educational Resources Council. I would like to introduce our esteemed guest. Dr. John Edward Martin is the Director of Scholarly Communication at the University of North Texas Libraries. His work focuses on scholarly publishing and scholarly impact services, OER, and open publishing support, data management planning, and education and outreach programming. Like any librarian, he has 15 jobs apparently. He serves as the chair of the Digital Scholarship Committee and as a member of the university's Graduate Council. He also organizes the Comic Studies at UNT Outreach Initiative. He has published articles and book chapters on scholarly communication, literary pedagogy, Gothic and horror fiction, and comic studies. He holds a PhD in English from Northwestern University and an MS in library science from the University of North Texas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to try to share my screen and my slides. And once I get started, I'm probably going to turn my camera off so that I don't have any kitty interruptions because she's getting a little feisty over here. But first, let me see if I can get to my slides. I'm uncertain how to do that. I'm not seeing the slides here. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Sarah.
Sorry, I tried to be quiet. If you hit the share, there should be an option to choose a window from your screen, and you can do it that way if they're pulled up on your screen.
Here we go. All right. Are you able to see that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. All right, let me turn off my camera there so that you can focus on the slides for a little bit. All right, well, yes, again, thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you all today about a topic that I think that I and a lot of other folks in higher education are pretty passionate about. And I don't mean specifically OER, although that will be the focus of the conversation today, but rather the larger issues of equity, affordability, accessibility, and frankly, the ethics of higher education, which is what I believe is really at stake here. Because when we talk about how knowledge and information and the materials that are needed for learning are produced and distributed and made available to students, we're talking about something that's really at the heart of all education. And that is the ability to learn and improve ourselves without unnecessary or unfair barriers or hardships. And while that may not have always been the reigning ethos of education in this country, particularly beyond our publicly subsidized secondary education, it has increasingly come to be recognized by many inside and outside of our field that higher education is both a necessary and a forward-thinking collective investment in our future, and one that needs to be more widely available to people of all classes, identities, ability, and sociocultural backgrounds, or else it only reinforces the existing social inequalities and injustices. The fact that higher education costs have become so burdensome for so many people, not just in the moment, but over the long term, finally seems to have entered the public and political consciousness in a major way with the recent efforts to address student loan debt. But even before those former students, including myself, faced a lifetime of debt and financial struggle, many of them have faced barriers to access at the most basic level, being able to navigate the admissions process, applying for financial aid, paying tuition and fees, receiving academic guidance, finding work that fits their schedules, securing housing or basic living necessities, arranging transportation or childcare, and securing the necessary technology and training needed to use it. And this was before they even made it to the bookstore, whether a physical or a virtual one. And what many people discover there is another hurdle that they had neither anticipated or fully prepared for. And that is the costs and challenges associated with securing course materials that they're required to have, and which in many cases aren't fully covered by financial aid. I can't tell if my slides are advancing here.
I still see the first one.
Yeah, I don't know. Here we go. Let me just do it manually. All right. At this point, anyone in higher education, and especially those of us in libraries and scholarly communications professions, are aware of what has come to be called the textbook crisis in higher education. We've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades that textbook costs have risen at nearly 3 times the rate of inflation, more quickly than other notoriously expensive consumer costs, including home prices and medical care. Now, the graph here is a little bit outdated, but it's still accurate. It was the best one I could pull up in the moment, but it shows an 82% increase in college textbook prices just between 2003 and 2013, so in a single decade. Now, if you look at the graph itself, you'll see that this trend goes all the way back to the 80s, and it has continued into the 2020s. And besides the enormous profits that are enjoyed by the 3 or 4 major textbook publishers, the steep increase has only served to place additional strains on both students and library budgets and has had even more damaging impacts on student performance, retention, and graduation rates. Several studies have shown that upwards of 65% of all college students report not purchasing a textbook at some point because of its high price, sometimes over $200 for a single book. A 2020 report from the Student PIRG, P-I-R-G, showed that out of 4,000 students surveyed from over 80 institutions, 25% reported having to work extra hours to afford course materials, 19% made course decisions based on the cost of materials, and 11% went without meals in order to afford course materials. A survey that we conducted here at our own university in 2019 showed that after the 12th class day, which is our drop deadline, only 57% of our students had purchased all the books and materials required for their classes. 29% had purchased only some of those materials, and 14% had purchased none of the course materials. So you can imagine the impact that's going to have on them later in their courses and later in their academic career. The reasons for not doing so, costs, obviously, and also the perception that these materials weren't really needed or to successfully complete the course, which is to say that many reported not using the bulk of material contained in these expensive textbooks during the course or not finding it particularly helpful in learning the specific skills or knowledge needed for their courses. Now, this may just be their way of telling us that the materials weren't actually tailored to the needs of their courses or assignments. But these concerns aren't limited to traditional print textbooks. As most of you who teach already know, many academic publishers now offer extensive packages of digital textbooks and supplemental materials that may be required or even included in the cost of a given course. But these materials, despite being more convenient, especially for online students, not only have cost barriers, but often technological ones, because they require students to have access to appropriate devices, software, and training to use. And as we in the libraries have discovered about many digital resources, they often have accessibility issues that publishers or vendors may or may not be willing to address, meaning that we have to through our libraries, our learning centers, our disability offices, et cetera. What's more, these digital packages often come with access restrictions, meaning that they can't be shared, expiration dates, meaning that they can't be kept beyond a single term or school year, and no ability to reuse or resell them to help reduce student expenses. So taken together, the disincentives for many students to continue purchasing such materials, whether or not they are in fact needed for the course, seem to outweigh the incentives, at least in their own cost to benefit analysis. But students, of course, aren't the only ones that are suffering from the high costs and the limited options available. Faculty, too, have increasingly voiced concerns over both the quality and availability of the kinds of materials that they need for their teaching. As a handful of large publishers have cornered the market on college course materials, many faculty find that they have limited choices available to them, especially in the more specialized fields of study or in advanced courses. As the students themselves noted, they often find that there's a lack of materials specifically tailored to their course needs or to the kinds of topics and skills that they wish to teach. Print textbooks and digital course packages alike are sometimes outdated or inflexible in their ability to address current topics or events, to be adapted to particular pedagogical approaches, or to be easily supplemented without purchasing additional materials. And because of both the costs and the practical barriers that students face, they often have trouble acquiring the necessary materials during the first week or two of a semester, meaning that they get off to a slower start or have to fill that time with other materials. So what do we do about this sort of perfect storm of challenges that seem to impair our ability to do the most basic work of higher education, which is to educate students and help them succeed in their courses. Well, not surprisingly, given the topic of this talk, this is where open education, and more specifically, open educational resources come in. And looking over your own action plan that Sarah Smith and the rest of your team there has already put together, it's obvious that you all have already done a lot of thinking about OER and its place in your future plans as an organization. So I feel like I may be preaching to the choir a little bit, or at least telling you a lot of things that you already know. But in my experience, especially with audiences of this size and this range, I think it's useful to always define our terms and explain a few of the basic principles so we're all kind of on the same page. The definitions that you see here are borrowed from the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, or SPARC. I'll have cause to mention them several times in this presentation because they are a major resource for learning about open education and OER. But they provide the basic premise of what we mean by open education. First of all, open education itself encompasses resources, tools, and practices that are free of legal, financial, and technical barriers and can be fully used, shared, and adapted in a digital environment. And likewise, open educational resources, or OER, are teaching, learning, and research resources that are free of cost and access barriers, and which also carry legal permission for open use. So while open education is the broader term and it encompasses practices, resources, tools, et cetera, open education resources, or OER, are the materials themselves that can be used to supplement or replace traditional course materials, including textbooks, in order to address some of the challenges that I was just talking about. At the core of open education are 5 features that OER must possess in order to meet the definitions of open that I just provided and to address the limitations of traditional print or digital course materials. These include the ability to retain, revise, remix, reuse, and redistribute these materials without cost or access barriers. And the right to do these things is typically provided by the application of an open license, like those provided by Creative Commons licenses and described in more detail on their website. If you were watching, you would have seen one right at the beginning of this presentation, but I've also provided the link there to the Creative Commons website where you can go and learn about the different licenses that can be applied to these materials if you're not already familiar with them. Now, contrary to some people's understanding, such licenses do not replace copyright law, but rather they supplement and define what copyrights creators wish to maintain or enforce. Licensed materials remain the property of their creators, and unlike traditionally published materials, they don't have to be reassigned to the ownership of a commercial publisher. Now, depending on your institution, you may share that ownership with the institution itself, depending on what kind of arrangement you've worked out and whether these materials are created as a part of your workload. As a result, these materials may circumvent many of the costs and access barriers that I talked about earlier. Moreover, they make the content of these materials more flexible, adaptable, and shareable across platforms and formats in various learning contexts and for a broad range of course topics, pedagogical approaches, and creative applications. Basically, they provide a way for us as educators and as students to pool our collective knowledge, our resources, and our interests to create the materials that we need to do the work of teaching and learning. I began this presentation talking primarily about textbook costs and limitations, since these are the kinds of course materials that most people are familiar with and which have seen the most dramatic rise in costs and access barriers. But textbooks are not the only things needed in a modern classroom or the only thing that can be created and shared through open licensing. Textbooks, in whatever form they're presented, offer only a narrow range of pedagogical, scholarly, or creative possibilities, and in many fields of study aren't particularly useful for learning at all. As the OER contact person at my own library, who both administers our open publishing platforms for both open textbooks and open journals, and our OER grants program, which provides stipends for faculty creating new OER materials for use in our own courses, I find myself increasingly asked by faculty about the possibilities for creating and providing things like supplemental learning materials, tests and quizzes, tutorials, videos and media, or data sets and data tools for their students, all of which can be created and licensed in the same way as textbooks. What's more, materials like course syllabi, lesson plans, assignments, even entire curricula may be shared between colleagues in the same institution or elsewhere using open licenses. Such materials may not only save faculty, and especially early career or contingent faculty, time and effort, but more importantly, allow for the productive sharing of ideas, approaches, and creative forms of pedagogy and practice. Most of us who have spent any time in classrooms have benefited from the examples and often even the materials shared with us by mentors, colleagues, or even students themselves. OER and open education as a practice simply make this informal process of sharing and learning from each other a more central part of our practice as educators. So all of this sounds pretty good in theory, but as I'm sure you all know, putting this theory into practice is never quite as easy as it sounds. Just as there are barriers to accessing and using traditional course materials, there are different, if sometimes equally challenging, barriers to creating and using OER. The most frequently cited ones that I've encountered are some of these that I've listed on the slide. A lack of awareness about where to find OER, a sparseness of quality materials, especially in specialized fields or topics, uncertainty about what licenses might allow, no experience or training in creating OER, lack of familiarity with accessibility needs or resources, no time or resources for researching and creating OER, and no designated places for sharing or distributing them. So I can't address all of these in depth in the time that we have, except to say that as daunting as this list may look, all of these hurdles, I believe, are eminently clearable, and likely with a lot less effort and expense than the challenges that we face in controlling textbook prices or other affordability issues on our campuses. Because the fact is that these are all things that people in education, libraries, scholarly publishing, and learning centers all over the world have been working on and developing for at least the last 2 decades, if not longer. There's a great deal of both expertise and resources already out there to help with these challenges, and existing models of courses, departments, and institutions that have been early adopters and successful practitioners of open education for quite some time. Which is simply to say, we know how to do this. What's called for is a commitment and an impetus or an incentive to do so. The bulk of the items on my previous list, I think, can be addressed primarily through, oops, I think I went backwards. Let me jump forwards. There we go. Okay. So the bulk of the items on my previous list can be addressed primarily through education and training by making resources on OER available, easily discoverable, and as comprehensive as we can make them. Fortunately, as I said, a lot of those resources already exist and can be tailored to your particular institution or faculty's needs, like all open resources. I'll share just a couple of examples of how we've started to do some of this work here at UNT, although I imagine that the particular needs and resources of your institution may be somewhat different. As I mentioned earlier, it looks like you all already have a team of folks who are working on a detailed action plan for implementing some OER initiatives on your campus. So they can probably give you more details on how some of this might be tailored to your own school. But as I said, the first step is simply to educate and make available as many resources on OER as you can. You see here a couple of images from our own library's OER guide, which includes sections on defining OER, locating OER materials, especially textbooks, a section on using OER, which is the Open Pedagogy tab, on evaluating it for quality and fit, as well as a page explaining how Creative Commons licenses work. And as you see there on the right, there are already a number of large repositories like LibreText and Merlot, digital portals like the Mason OER MetaFinder and OER Commons, as well as a number of established open textbook publishers like OpenStax at Rice University or Oxford Open that are providing high-quality OER materials for many of the most commonly taught courses in a variety of disciplines. Typically, these are textbooks for large intro courses that are common to a lot of different universities, especially public universities with high enrollment. More advanced textbooks and OER materials might also be found through resources like the Directory of Open Access Books or the Pressbooks Directory. And speaking of Pressbooks, if you aren't already familiar with it, it's the platform that we use here at UNT to publish our own faculty-created open textbooks that have been tailored to specific courses within our degree programs, but which we also make available for free to the public through our Open Books website and catalog. Pressbooks is an open source platform that can be used in both a free version, which is what we have here, or by subscription if you want to take advantage of their hosting and technical support services. It's built on the same basic platform as WordPress, which you use for creating blogs or websites. So if you're familiar with that tool, I think the learning curve for Pressbooks is relatively easy. We have two ways of subsidizing the creation of these books. First, through a free account available to all of our faculty members, which they can use at any time to create textbooks or reading packets, with some support from me on technical questions or licensing issues or obtaining DOIs for their materials. But for the most part, they can go in, learn the platform, and I do provide lots of training materials so they can get a quick start on Pressbooks and create the content themselves at their own pace. Secondly, though, we have a collaborative agreement with our university press, the UNT Press, to accept some open textbook proposals that will receive a small stipend from the press. And this is in lieu of the kinds of royalties that they might get through a commercial publisher if they chose to go that direction. Now, we can't offer necessarily the same amount that those publishers might offer, especially the big publishers, but it's a token. It's a little bit of an incentive to go ahead and publish through us. But they also provide their usual peer review and copy editing services. And then the book itself is published in both a low-cost print version and in a free online version through our Pressbooks site. So it's dually published through the press and the libraries. And for those faculty who hope to receive credit on their tenure and promotion reviews, these kinds of peer-reviewed, professionally edited texts may carry a little bit more weight, which is why we try to offer this option. But for those simply looking to create tailored, easily available materials for their courses, the Pressbooks only option is often the easiest and quickest solution. And you can see there on the right, one of the textbooks that was created through this platform for a very specific course in our curriculum. Now, in mentioning our Pressbooks platform and our open textbook stipends, I'm addressing two of the items on my previous list of challenges to implementation that can't be met just through education and training, but which require both an investment and an infrastructure to provide, especially if you want to encourage your faculty to create their own OER that are tailored to their own and their students' needs. The first of these is, of course, time and resources for creating OER. That can include grants, incentives, technical support, other types of support, particularly through our libraries. Sorry, I lost my place here. And we've tried to incentivize these activities and provide options like our collaborative agreement with the university press that they might be able to take back to their own departments to make a case for including this work in their workload agreements or in their promotion and tenure dossiers. We've also tried to provide the necessary platforms for sharing and distributing OER, not only on our own campus, but beyond it. And these include the Pressbooks platform for open textbooks, our Open Journal Systems platform for online journals, our digital library for collections of digital and OER materials, and our Canvas learning management system, where faculty can share their resources directly with students in their courses. Canvas also has a commons area where it can be shared with other users at other institutions that are also using the same platform. And we also make a point of cataloging and linking all of our open textbooks through our library's online catalog for easier discovery, either by colleagues or by students or anyone else who wants to make use of them. But beyond these kinds of efforts, which the library can largely do on its own, there are steps that can be taken beyond the libraries at the department or even institutional level to help support the use and creation of OER. A big one that I've already mentioned is reconsideration of promotion and tenure guidelines to provide explicit support for this kind of work, which may be regarded as publication or teaching or service, depending on the discipline or the institution, but which should grant faculty some incentive or reward for taking time to redesign their courses, research new materials, create OER that's tailored to specific needs, or contribute to the larger community of OER resources that are available to other users. I would argue that a free and useful textbook for a commonly taught course is a contribution to the field itself, not just to your own institution. And finally, the students themselves need to be both educated and informed about the availability of OER materials in their courses. Texas recently passed a law, although it's not that recent, it's a couple of years ago now, that required public colleges and universities to create a course marking system, either in their online catalogs or their bookstore sites, that allows students to identify or search for courses that have adopted OER in place of traditional textbooks or course materials. Your state may have a similar kind of law, but I do know that, at least in looking through your action plan, you have also already started on doing something like this. And I feel this is an extremely important element to both letting students know that these options are available, and also giving that information to them while they're selecting courses, so that they can make responsible decisions about what kinds of courses and what kinds of materials they're using. But why go to all this trouble to create and distribute course materials that can be more easily purchased through existing established academic publishers? Well, if the cost alone isn't enough of an incentive, and I think it certainly is for many lower income students or those who are facing unusual financial stresses, you can also consider the benefits to teaching. Being able to adapt materials to specific course needs, being able to update or supplement these materials easily and inexpensively, being able to use them from the first day of classes, and then being able to share them instantly with colleagues and audiences around the world, thus increasing their reach and impact on the field. It also helps support and promote other institutional efforts to lower the cost of education overall. And if all of that isn't incentive enough, consider this. A number of studies have shown that students who use OER materials perform at least as well as those who use traditional textbooks or course materials. Two particular studies done by Virginia State University and Houston Community College, respectively, found that students who used open textbooks actually had higher grades and lower withdrawal rates than peers who used traditional textbooks. So any fears, and I have heard these in the past, of lower quality or worse outcomes in relation to OER seem to have been largely discredited by the evidence available. Now, in my own experience, and this is speaking purely from my own perspective, I found that most students' ability to learn is influenced far more by their relationships with their instructors and their classroom peers, and by their ability to focus their concentration and energies without undue stress, than it is by the quality of the course materials. But having materials that both contribute to their learning and save them from some of those stresses can only be beneficial. And I think most of the evidence that we've seen supports that. Okay, I'm actually going to stop there because I wanted to leave us plenty of time to have questions or discussion, because I feel like there's a lot of aspects here that we could go further in depth on, but since I'm not as familiar with all of the things that you all are doing and talking about, I'd love to hear from some of you about the kinds of things you're interested in, the kinds of questions you have, and yeah, kind of get a conversation started. So let me see if I can stop sharing, and I will go back to my camera. There we go. So yes, I'm happy to take some questions or comments.
And if you want to add them into chat, I'll bring them up to Dr. Martin's attention as well.
Absolutely.
I will say I wanted to echo something that you said and you were talking about what students have to, their struggles, like they won't buy a textbook because they need to put food in their mouths or in their children's mouths, right, or they will go without eating, that type of situation. Well, we did a survey we're going to do it again, but we did it 2 years ago, and it plays out along the same lines. Like they will let go of something in order to attend their class, or they'll take fewer credit hours so that they can go into classes. And so even our own students' data reflect that same outcome.
Yeah. And I don't feel like that's necessarily a new problem. I think especially at large public institutions, at community colleges, I've taught at both. These are issues that have existed for a long time. I mean, there may not have been a lot of attention paid to it or a lot of formal study of it being done, but it's always been there. what I think has shocked some people is to see how much worse it's gotten over time, and that we do have students, even students who maybe have scholarships or have financial aid or have jobs, are still struggling. We've had conversations on our own campus about homeless students, about students who didn't have food, who had students who were struggling with childcare, and then this was all before the pandemic. During the pandemic, things just seem to have gotten exponentially worse in all of these aspects. And so, right, I think finding, having to make choices and having to make difficult choices about what they can do has made all of these things a little more difficult. So, yeah, they're not going to buy course materials if they need food or medicine or transportation to campus. Those are the priorities. And they're also not going to use materials that they feel like they're not going to get much out of. Right? They're spending a lot of money and not necessarily getting what they think they're supposed to get from them. So yeah, dropping the materials is the first step, but then as we see, it can proceed to dropping courses, dropping out of degree programs, dropping out of school altogether. And that's, of course, what we don't want to see. And I don't want to blame all that on textbook costs, but obviously they all contribute to each other.
I'll note one of our colleagues is pushing a great resource we have at our institution, which is the Student Advocacy and Resource Center, which is invaluable to our students' needs. I also noted that you mentioned those course markings, and we have made progress there. We have the ability now to add course characteristics for free, which is zero cost for required course materials, or low, which is required course materials of $40 or less, as defined by our council. Trying to get, this week has been good to help us get the word out that these characteristics are available to be added by our course builders. The next step is really making sure that our students know how to find them when they're working, to search for classes so that they can help themselves, basically.
Yeah.
But do you have any recommendations for strategies to communicate about our OER efforts to our students?
That is a great question, and it's actually one that we're still wrestling with and struggling with, because I think we've faced the same thing. I mean, there are a lot of complications with the course marking process. It seems like a simple thing to do, and I think technically it's a simple thing to do, but logistically often it is not. It's hard to sometimes get faculty to report the adoption of OER, because they think since they're not buying a textbook, they don't have to report it. And so we don't get that information added to the catalog, certainly not in time for registration. Sometimes the bookstore isn't notified of these choices. Even if they are, they don't really know how to provide links or information for how to find them or how to get to them. And so there's all of that complication. And then, as you said, on the other end, students themselves either don't know what OER means or don't know how to find that information, whether it's searching the catalog or looking through the bookstore lists. It's something that they haven't been educated on themselves, and so they don't know to look for it. It's hard to make a reasonable choice if you don't know what the options are or what they mean. So I think that is something that we're still struggling with, and we're looking at ways that we can do that. Obviously we can promote this through our social media channels, through their orientations, through our website, our library guides, all of these things. But still trying to get their eyes on that and then get them thinking about it and get them recognizing that it's important, I think takes time. Because this is not going to be high on their list of of things that they have to think about when they first come to campus, right? Like I said, there's a lot of more immediate needs that they need to meet. And so they often don't think about the cost of course materials until they're standing there in the bookstore or online looking at the bookstore page and realizing just how much this is going to hit them. And by then it's too late. They're enrolled, they're registered, they're in the courses. And so, yeah, I think that's a legitimate question. I don't have an easy answer, because I think we have to just employ everything that we have available. I would like to add this kind of information to their orientations and have an opportunity to go talk to them directly. But we have, 40,000 students. So the chances of being able to get that information to all of them easily is not an easy thing to do.
Thank you. We have a comment and question in chat. As an adjunct, I do not get paid to make up my own materials, though obviously I do that anyway. I did try to create a text through a publisher, which cut the cost considerably to my students, but they could not use FA resources to purchase the text, financial aid resources, to purchase the text from the publisher. So the bookstore ordered them and charged a 50% markup. This would be a great resource for my students, but I am overwhelmed at the non-paid work this would be. And what suggestions do you have for us as an institution to deal with this issue?
Wow, yeah, there's like 5 issues there. And I think that is the challenge, right? On the one hand, there is the difficulty of the time and the resources that faculty themselves would need. And as I said, this is one of those things that it's hard until you get some institutional buy-in and buy-in from departments and colleges and promotion committees. Like, they all have to say, look, we support this, we want to reward this, we're willing to make allowances to give you the time to do this, whether it's a course leave, whether it's credit towards your promotion and tenure, whether it's financial incentives to help pay for that extra time that you're having to spend. Those are all things that have to come from those who can provide them, and that's usually the institutional level. We've tried to do some of that through the library. We did get a little pot of money the last couple of years through our president's office because they were promoting affordability efforts, and we pitched this as one of the things that would help. But that was a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of energy on our part to get those incentives sort of added. And even then, we can't force departments to change their promotion and tenure guidelines. That's a conversation that has to happen within those departments and within those disciplines to say, look, this is something we value. This is something we're willing to promote and to support. So that's a big question. That's one that has to be dealt with, both at the institutional and the department level. Now, in terms of these some of these other challenges that you're talking about, yes, I think there are a number of academic publishers out there who have made gestures towards open access, providing open access, and they will offer various options for doing that. But as you note, they often come with strings, right? Either students can't purchase the print volume. Usually what happens is there's a print volume that's supposedly lower cost and then a free open access version. And that's kind of what we're doing with our own press, is that we give them, some people just prefer to have a print textbook. And if we can give them that and make it affordable, low cost, that's a good option for them. But then there are those who, especially online students, distance learners, those who are on limited budgets, who will prefer the online text. And so we try to provide both. But as you noted, even for the low cost print versions, a lot of times students can't use their financial aid. And again, this is an issue that has to be taken up at the institutional level, or in our case, because we're a public institution, that might have to be taken up at the state level, right? Because they're the ones who determine the rules around financial aid and how it can be spent. And so again, those are big policy decisions that have to play into it. Now, none of that helps an individual instructor who's trying to do this, because they can't go change the policy and they can't necessarily address all these bigger issues by themselves. And that's why I think, having options like Pressbooks is really great. Now, you can get a Pressbooks member account of your own. You don't have to go through an institution. And you can create those books. Now, then the question becomes, where do you put it? You can create it in Pressbooks, but then you need a platform to share it. Typically, depending on your learning management system, it can be shared through things like Canvas. But whether your library can add those things to collection, whether they can provide links, whether you have a digital library or some other repository on campus that can take that material and make it available, those are questions you'd have to ask at your institution. Like, I can go onto Pressbooks, create a free account, build my textbook. I may or may not get paid for that time. I may or may not get time off for it. But if I do that, I then have to figure out how to get it to the students. And I think those are some of the logistical challenges that libraries can help with, but so can learning centers, and other units on campus can sometimes help with that. So that was a long, complicated answer to that question, because I think you're identifying a number of the different challenges that go with all of this.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Because that goes right into, I just put a comment in chat. We, through our consortium, Mobius, the libraries have, it's basically a repository hub in the OER Commons for faculty deposited OER content. And I know our math faculty has already availed themselves of that. Going back up to a question. Our department, chemistry, is looking for AOER options. We are aware of OpenStax and Chemistry LibreText. Do you know where we would find more options? I apologize if you mentioned this, but are there repositories we could look into to see what's out there outside of random internet searches? I will put in a plug for our librarians at the St. Louis Community College Libraries, because our librarians are here to support you and help you find these resources. But Dr. Martin.
No, absolutely. And of course, that would be my first suggestion, is to talk to your librarians, because they typically, are interested in this, have this information, or can help you find it. And we also have some other units on our campus that do some of this. We have CLEAR, which is our Center for Learning. I'll never remember what all that stands for, but it's our learning center, that also manages our Canvas library management system. And they also have a lot of folks there who are interested in open education and open educational resources, and they can help you not only find them, but integrate them into the course system. And I think some collaboration of those units, libraries, learning centers, our Disability Services Center has done a lot of work with us on accessibility, making sure that whatever resources we find are made accessible to our students. And it's often so much easier to make an open textbook or an OER resource accessible than it is to do with a commercial textbook. If that wasn't part of the process by the publisher or the vendor in the first place, getting them to do it afterwards can be extremely difficult. So it's a lot easier to do that if you have an open source material that you can either do it yourself if you have the skills, or you can work with the people on your campus who are familiar with accessibility. So those are some places you can look. I also just put a link here to our guide. Now, as I said, a lot of that guide is tailored to our own institution, but a lot of those links are to publicly available resources, including repositories and portals and search engines that will help you find OER. I mean, the only challenge there is that they're not all connected, and so sometimes it takes a while. You have to search through the different sources that are out there and look for things in your specific area. It's very hard to find resources on very specific topics or advanced courses, and I think that's been the biggest area of growth for OER in the last couple of years, is trying to fill some of those needs. And so there are resources like the Directory Open Access Books, and what was the other one that I mentioned earlier? The Pressbooks Directory. That's where a lot of people are creating more advanced books, materials, even scholarly books, and those resources can help you find materials like that. Now, whether they are of the quality that you're looking for or meet your specific needs, that takes some time and research on your own part. That's something that even we as librarians can't necessarily help with, because we're not subject experts in every topic. So that's where faculty themselves have to be able to go to those resources and look through the materials that are there. But I think your librarians can certainly help you figure out how to find them, how to search for them, figure out which resources are there. So if you take a look through that guide, you'll see a bunch of others that we've made available for our own faculty.
And my colleagues who are faculty librarians have been chat bombing with all sorts of helpful information to assist our faculty with local resources from the college. And I really appreciate that. Yeah. I have, one thing I also hear in my conversations with faculty about A&O OER projects, and especially OER projects, it surrounds that supplementary material content creation, especially for a discipline. These are, as you mentioned, I was so excited by your slide that about where you were talking about, supplementary materials that because teaching requires them. The modern day teaching requires them. The state of Missouri is not organized in a way that there are like groups of faculty from across community colleges in the state, or even public institutions of higher education in the state, to wrap themselves around discipline-based OER creation of materials. And other states are so far ahead of this game. How do you get faculty together in a discipline to talk about going away from what maybe their textbook that they're using to create supplementary materials and in addition to content?
No, I think you're right. It is a challenge, and Texas does have a lot of resources. I mean, we have OpenStax here in the state, and they not only produce really great quality textbooks, but they also sponsor workshops and symposia and gatherings of people from around the state to come and do OER creation, or to learn how to create some of these materials. And so we do have some of those resources, and whenever I see announcements like that, I share them with the faculty and say, hey, you might want to go to this weekend OER creation thing that OpenStax, or we have a couple of other organizations in Texas that do similar things. I think you can look around to find some of those, but if you're trying to do it within your own community or your own institution, I found obviously there are some departments and disciplines that are more open or further ahead on this than others, and I found that a lot of the sciences are actually pretty open to this, partly because increasingly science research is becoming more and more open access, largely because of federal grant guidelines that require them to make their research open. But I think it's opened the door for them to say, oh, yes, it makes sense now that we make not only our research openly available, but that we find teaching materials and textbooks that we can make openly available. And they have been less hesitant to say adopt a common biology textbook across the department, across all the sections of a course, than say English department, which I think is a whole different story in terms of how they choose texts and what kinds of texts and what quality they need, et cetera. That's a bigger ask. We've made progress with things like our first year writing program, because again, the idea of a common text across sections is a lot more, I think, sensible for a course like that. Less so maybe for an upper level English course. So I think you have to go department by department, discipline by discipline, and see what their needs are. Some will be much more open, I think, because they teach a lot of big intro classes where it makes sense to have a common textbook. Others, may be more interested in the customization aspect, the flexibility. I have a lot of colleagues in the humanities, in English and other disciplines, who teach really interesting subjects like comic studies, there are no existing textbooks for them. So they have to be creative, and they have to find materials that they can kind of pull together in different forms to teach that topic. It may be OER material, it may be library materials, it may be freely available things online. It may be subscriptions to some of the digital comics platforms. So there are lots of different ways that you can approach it, but I think you do just have to go, department by department to figure out, okay, what makes sense for you? What are the things that your faculty are willing to do in this regard? And can they do it on a scale, of the entire department, or does it have to be class by class? And I think obviously you have to work in both directions. But yeah, figuring out how to provide them with that training and that experience that they need to be able to start doing it. It's going to be different for each group, and it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of people and a lot of time to do all of that.
Well, we are almost out of time. I know Mike noted that there's some wonderful public domain content that gets introduced to us. At Public Domain Day every year is almost like my happy day.
Yeah.
And
that great stuff this year.
There is some really amazing resources, so please check out the link in chat that my colleague Mike has posted. And I can't thank you enough, Dr.
Absolutely.
Martin,
Thank you.
for being with us today, and you've provided us with some amazing information. I would like to get my hands on those PowerPoint slides so I can disseminate them further. But I also just wanted to shout out to 2 o'clock for the rest of the week, when we will have more sessions during the service week on OER topics sponsored by the ANOER Council. But thank you again, Dr. Martin. This has been very rewarding for all of us.
Well, thank
Thank
you.
you all.
This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
All right, everybody, have a great day.